met my husband Graham at a children's birthday party one December. I'd seen him in passing a couple of times as we were both single parents and our boys went to the same nursery while we went to work. At this particular birthday party, we finally had a conversation and we ended up exchanging phone numbers on the pretext that we could arrange for the boys to get together and play sometime. That evening I was seeing a friend and I remember saying to them, "I've just met the man I'm going to marry." I knew with absolute certainty during that party that Graham and I were meant for each other. I thought about Graham a lot after that, but Christmas came and went and I didn't hear anything from him, and then January also disappeared without a phone call. At the beginning of February, I realised that our nursery days were numbered. Robin was due to start school after Easter, and Dawn was going to start in September, and I knew that there might only be a few months in which we still had that childcare connection. So with a fair bit of trepidation, I finally rang him and we arranged to get together and take the boys to the cinema to see the film Monsters, Inc. My step of faith paid off, and the rest, as they say, is history. That party was 19 years ago, and we just seem to get happier and happier in being together, which is where we both feel most at home. You might be wondering what on earth this has to do with the Bible reading we've heard today, the parable of the talents as it's often called. Well, I think that at the heart of this parable is the call to take a risk, and although taking the first move to make contact with Graham may not sound too difficult, there was a whole lot of mental deliberation going on around it. On the one hand, my life was okay and I didn't really want to open myself up to the possibility of rejection. What if the spark between us was all in my head? What if his circumstances had changed and he was seeing someone else? Could I handle the fact that he might not be interested in me? On the other hand, I knew what the future could be, I hoped, and I knew that someone was going to have to do something to see if it could happen. For the sake of possible future happiness and fulfillment, I chose not to let my fear and nervousness prevent me from taking action. And so here we are today. This parable comes directly after the parable that was in the lectionary for last Sunday, the parable of the wise and foolish bridesmaids. So it's clearly in the part of Jesus' teaching that focuses firstly on Jesus' departure and then on his anticipated return. Matthew is writing for people who were already grappling with the fact that Jesus has not yet returned. When would it happen? What would it be like? What does it mean for the church? Why the apparent delay? Matthew is mindful that expectations of an imminent return would be dwindling, and he tries to draw his readers away from speculation on dates and times. Instead, Matthew puts together these parables of Jesus that emphasise that the when is always unknown. These parables turn the attention away from worrying about God's schedule and towards the issues at hand, to faithfulness and preparedness and risk. Waiting and watching for Jesus' return really means being good stewards of all our resources, and especially the gospel. In today's parable, two of the servants took that calling seriously. They were faithful to their master, prepared to do what they believed he would want them to do, and ready to take risks in order that this might be achieved. But what about the third servant? What's his problem? He's not a dishonest servant out to get whatever he can. There's no hint in the story of fraud or deceit or scandal. We don't hear that he's planning to embezzle funds while the master is away, or that he secretly wants to lead an extravagant lifestyle. We puzzle at the treatment he receives when the master returns. After all, we might think, what's wrong with being cautious? Shouldn't discretion and deliberateness be seen as virtues, as good qualities? With this third servant, our sensible notions are turned upside down. What we see as a virtue is shown up to be a vice. Prudence and wariness easily become self-protectiveness and miserliness. Inhibition turns to fear, and the third servant ends up refusing to take the risk of trading with the money he's been given. He thinks that if he preserves exactly what has been entrusted to him, then he can stay in favour with his master. Despite the fact that his master has shown confidence in him, He obviously sees the master as harsh and judgmental. He decides that it's better to preserve his own safety and security than to run the risk of losing the money and making his master angry. For Matthew's readers, the main risk that they faced was to do with the public expression of the gospel. For the early church facing persecution, the question was whether they would keep the gospel safely and securely tucked away amongst themselves, or whether they would take the risk of letting it loose in the wider world and sharing it. All love involves risks, and so Matthew is trying to say that loving Jesus and waiting for his return means rejecting the temptation of security in the face of fear and intimidation, and instead taking the risk of discipleship with all its unknowns and dangers and perils. So this passage perhaps raises some challenging questions, not least around the nature of the master. The two servants who invested wisely are rewarded, but the nervous third servant who simply hid the money is treated rather harshly. The money's taken away from him and he is thrown out. How do we square this with the image of a gracious and generous God who accepts people as they are, whether they're well behaved or badly behaved, and whether they're seen to have achieved much or little in the world's eyes? The first two servants don't get a pay rise or an extra holiday or a framed certificate to put up, but they do get two things. Firstly, they get more responsibility. The master tells them, "You've been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things." So the reward for taking that initial risk was the burden of greater risk and the challenge of larger investments. At no point do they get to sit back and feel pleased with themselves. And alongside that extra responsibility comes the second reward, the joy of the master's presence. "Come in and share my happiness," says the master. This contrasts with the third servant who loses two things. He loses both the responsibility of being a steward and the joy of the master's presence. So in this parable, Matthew is clarifying the alternatives that the early Christians face. To those who choose security over risk, perhaps it seems that God is a harsh master. Fearfulness breeds more fear and results in a distorted image of God. This misunderstanding of God paralyzes our response and perhaps leads us to feel rejected and left out. But those who risk discover a God who is ready to share the joy of God's presence and the thrill of participation in God's mission. Like those early Christians, we have been entrusted with the gospel. And like those early Christians, we have to make choices about what we're going to do about it. Somebody once said to me that about 50 years ago, the church in this country sat down to a picnic and forgot to get up again. We were used to not having to try too hard. Church was a building you went to, and there was a social expectation by and large that people did attend. We haven't quite got used to the fact that people won't automatically come to us anymore. We're no longer perceived as a pillar of society, and we've lost confidence in stepping out of our comfort zone to let people see how we have been transformed by the love we have found in Jesus. We've become fearful, and so we've succumbed to temptation, the temptation to sit tight and cling on to all that we've got. We're scared to risk changing anything, and we've turned in on ourselves, closing ranks in self-defence. We're no longer entrusted with new Christians to nurture and journey in discipleship with. And we've lost the joy of Jesus' presence. These are the self-inflicted consequences of our reluctance to be open-handed, generous risk-takers for Jesus. This may be where we are, but this is not where we need to stay. The good news is that this choice about what to do with the gospel comes to us again and again, day by day. Jesus asks us to choose risk, to risk being shunned or ridiculed or rejected in the knowledge that we're not responsible for anyone else's response, only our own. To risk vulnerability in forming meaningful relationships, full of the potential for transformation. To risk loving without limits, just as we are unconditionally loved. If 19 years ago I'd chosen the safe option, I'm not sure where I would be today. In risking rejection by pursuing Graham, I opened myself up to much more than I'd bargained for. Graham was instrumental in conveying to me God's call to ordained ministry, and he continues to challenge me in growing a risk-taking, borderless prophetic faith every day. I imagined none of this when I was deliberating about whether to ring him or not all that time ago. None of us knows exactly what the future holds, but I do know this. Secure in God's sacrificial love and trusting in God's generous faithfulness, we can step out in faith, opening our hands and our hearts to extravagantly share all that we have received. And I know that with the love of God at the centre of our lives, whatever risks we take for the sake of the gospel will lead us into greater joy and deeper awareness of the transformative possibilities that are there, if only we are willing to participate in God's extravagant mission. Amen.